Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. We do still have some people, looks like they're sort of coming on, but we are going to go ahead and get started with the webinar. I do have the question box open down here. So if anybody has a question along the way, I will be checking them frequently. Excuse me. Please feel free to ask your questions. I will do my best to answer them while we are all here on the webinar. If there is anything that anyone asks that I am unable to answer, I will make sure that I do find that answer so that when I follow up with the email after the webinar, I'll be able to provide you with that information. So today we are going to be talking about complex data forms, how to implement them in your app. And hopefully everyone saw the information that I had up earlier. I'm just going to pop it up on the screen just in case. For those of you who might not already have done so, please feel free to go out to your device app store, Google or Apple, and download the Snappii Preview app. This will allow you to follow along with us so that as I'm explaining to you how things are set up with forms on the back end, you'll be able to see how the user experiences them from the device perspective. So again, the credentials are here. The login is webinar@snappii.com and the password is webinar. There are several apps there for those of you who are logging in, and the one you want to pick is the oil and gas forms demo. We've done a couple of different variations of form in here, and I'm going to kind of walk you through all of those details. So, excuse me, here in the Snappii WYSIWYG editor, there are those of you who may be familiar with advanced lists in Snappii, and advanced forms, a lot of the layout and functionality is the same as the way advanced lists are laid out, but there are definitely some key differences as well. And there is also interoperability with advanced forms and advanced lists, and we will talk about some of that today. There is a lot of information to cover. So two things I will say to you is I may go relatively quickly, and I do apologize if I'm a little quick for some people. I just want to be sure that we touch each of the things that we can to just at least give you that base knowledge. I am recording this webinar, so that will be posted from the snappii.com website, and we also will send the link out to you to that recorded webinar in the follow-up email so that you can go back in, and sort of see it again. We're also going to be doing a second webinar, sort of a phase 2, if you will, for this particular webinar because there is so much information, and there are regular forms, there are advanced forms, there are advanced forms with relationships, and there just is so much to cover that really trying to cram in an overview in the time that we have would just be too fast to touch on everything. So we will really sort of be focusing on how to set up forms and advanced forms and combine those with advanced lists. And then a sort of a second phase of the webinar will be talking more about relationships. So if you're looking at the Snappii WYSIWYG editor here, and again, you certainly can follow along on your smart device as well, you'll see there are sort of 3 tabs down here related to forms. There's an oil and gas form that we have here. There is a forms tab, and then there is a risk assessment tab. I want to look at this first one, the oil and gas form here. This is actually, believe it or not, the most basic level of form that we offer. It is just a standard form. In this case, it was a tab that we dropped down, and it was the form tab. Excuse me. You could also accomplish this same functionality here by using the form button, which is right here. If you had a screen, for example, your home screen here, and you wanted your forms to appear all on one screen, you could utilize the form button or even the advanced form button. Drop it over onto your screen and then follow the prompts. I'm going to walk you through the advanced form, the standard form that we already set up here using a tab, but the information I'm giving you would be the same if you used a button as well. So I am going to drop a new tab just so you can see, because for those of you who may be familiar with having used forms before, we have changed the functionality a little bit to try and make it easier for you. So I'm just going to drop a new form tab down here. And you'll see that you've got some options. Your view options is just how it's displayed to your end users. So your title, which goes up here in the title bar, your tab name, which appears down here, and your icon. And you could choose from any of the icons in our pre-built library or upload one of your own, black and white with appropriate alpha transparency. Submitting by email. In this particular case, this form we have set up to submit by email. So any of you who may be testing this form today, excuse me, if you do test the form, it will actually generate an email to us on the back end with all of the form information. That's how we'll see that you're testing the form. But this is where you could put in an email address or multiple email addresses where you would like the form to be submitted if you were having the form emailed. And you have the availability to have that email be in a spreadsheet format, in the body of the email itself, or as a PDF. You also have the opportunity to specify how many times you want the form to be filled out before it is sent. So for example, we have it set for 1, so that every time someone fills out that form, that's going to be submitted to us by email. If you want to be able to set it for 5 or 10 times, so perhaps every time the form is filled out 5 times, not necessarily by the same user, but by any user who might be filling out the form, you can do that as well, and then the forms will be culminated and sent to you that way. You can submit by web post. So as opposed to having it submitted by email, you could have a web post mode. You would just click the web post button, and then you would have the opportunity to determine if you are getting information or posting information. So a very simple example of a get web post might be weather. So you might put in a form in your app where you want users to be able to find out the weather in their area based on entering their zip code. You could set up your form with the get post information. You would determine what the response type excuse me, would be. And then, oops, sorry about that. And then you would determine the URL, in which case, for example, in the Snappii user manual, which you can find under the resources section of the snappii.com website, we have an example of setting up a weather form so that users could put in zip code information and pull the weather information back into the app. And we do have a specific URL for you to utilize to be able to do that. But again, depending on what it was you were trying to accomplish, whether it was getting information to pull into the app or posting the form information that is filled out to the web, perhaps a URL that you've specifically specified to display that information, you can set that up here. And then time settings. Just your basic setting for time, which could certainly be important if your forms are time sensitive and you need to track when they have arrived. Once you have set up the basics here, you then click the field wizard. And this, and this is something new that we have created to try to help make things a little bit easier for you. This is what you see now in the Forms wizard. Again, this is a what I would call a basic form. Not that you can't have complex information submitted through a basic form. It just means that the setup of the form is different than when you're using an advanced form, which we'll review in a few minutes. So you have all of your basic information, as you can see here, different fields that you can select to add to your form. So for example, if you are adding a text field, this is something where users might be filling out basic information like their name. When you label it here, this is for your purposes to know what the different fields are. And your users will excuse me, be able to see this as well very shortly. Presently, they're going to be seeing a blank screen, and you'll be able to title that information so they'll know what they need to put into these different fields. Once you've labeled your field, you can click OK. And you basically would repeat this exact same process for any fields that you wanted to add. For example, a multiple choice field, same type of process. You pick it, you click Add. You can name it what you want. Excuse me. And as you do these fields, they will line up in the order that you have selected. And if you decided that you might use this form again later on, you could save the form field as a template. When you went in to do this form again, you'd be able to click it from the template and not have to individually add or delete the fields. Excuse me, they would be ready to go for your next form. When you have all the fields you want, you simply click OK. And now you can see that the various fields are here. You then can add text on top of these fields. Presently, the text labeling button, if you will, or titling button, is separate from the Forms wizard. That will be changing moving forward, so that information will all be in one place, and you'll be able to add the information as you're building your form. But you can see here that I dragged over the text information, and I am labeling this for my end users, so they are going to know what I want them to put in each specific field. And again, you could repeat this same process all the way through your form. What I'm going to do is go back to the form that we have created so that you can see all of the fields that we have added here. So as you can see, these are the text fields that we just added, like name, that tell your user what to put into the different fields in the form. Those of you who are looking at the form on your device will see what I mean when you click on that form. You'll see that the fields themselves, even though on the back end right now you see information in those fields, the end user sees these as blank because this is where they're going to be entering their information. If we scroll down a bit through the form, you can see that I have a number of different fields here. Text fields, as we have here, a date and time field. And again, feel free to utilize this form as we're walking through it so that you can experience what it is like on the user's end. The select location box. The way that this will work, click it here so that you can see. The fields that you're filling in show how the information is going to be displayed and in what order. And order is related to how you see it on the back end. So for example, if this form is being emailed to you, you want your users excuse me, to fill in the information and then have it displayed to you in a specific order in that email, whether it is the body of an email or in a spreadsheet. You can define in what order those images and different information show up to you on the back end. When a user has their GPS turned on their device and they click the select location button, a map will then show up based on the area where they are presently located. They then have the availability to select any point on that map, depending on the device you have. For example, my device, it's Android, I see a little red star. I can then move around the map, pick the location that I want. Once I've selected my location, that little red star moves over to that specific location. I can then hit done. And for those of you following along on your device, if you do that process, you will then see a little tiny Google map show up where the blank select location box was, and that is the information that is going to be submitted. So for example, in this case, where we have different oil and gas forms being filled out, those users who are out, employees inspecting these tanks and different rigs, can simply touch the location on the map rather than having to fill out address and city, state, zip code, or even latitude and longitude information. It's all put in there automatically by use of this location button. And so scrolling down a little further, you can see all of the different fields, that we have created. So this is a very detailed form. There is a lot of information that can be submitted by way of this form. And you may find for your purposes, the simple form or basic form, if you will, allows you all of the functionality you might need for your forms. They can be, as I said, extremely detailed. You can use multiple forms with each their own tab or on a single tab, as I mentioned here, by using the Forms button. Once this form is then completed, the user simply hits the Submit button, which, excuse me, again, if you scroll all the way down the form, you will see that the Submit button is there. Once that is hit, that form will submit, in this case, again, to an email, because that is how we have it set up. You will also notice down on the far end of the form that we have signature areas. Certainly for detailed forms like this where inspections are happening, we want to be sure that we have a signature from the various people who are doing the inspections. And so we've added not only signatures from the customer in this case and from the person who is performing the service, but also from a manager as well. And again, if you click on any one of those signature buttons, you can see that a blank box opens up, or a blank screen, if you will. Using your finger, you can just sign and hit OK. And once you have done that, you'll see that it is processing. It will then show up in the signature box within the form itself. When you submit this information, those signatures will be included as part of that form. So again, you really can get a lot of very detailed information included in what we would consider a simple form format. You also have the availability of using advanced forms when you may have even more detailed information that you want to have filled out, or have options for how that information gets displayed. Again, in the case of our basic form, you could choose to have it sent by email or a web post. When you use an advanced form, you also have the flexibility of having that information fed back into the app, either on the back end to then be downloaded by an app owner, excuse me, or could even be displayed within the app in a different location by way of an advanced list. So I'm going to walk through that with you, how that could happen. And the first thing you want to do, and for those of you who have seen advanced lists at all, you will know exactly what I'm talking about here, is data sources. You need to have data sources set up in order to be able to take advantage of the advanced form and advanced list functionality. Before I move on, I'm just going to check the question box here. Okay, great. I don't see that we have any questions, and that is okay. This is a lot of information to take in. So as I said, please feel free, if you have questions as we go along, to drop them in the box. And also as well, following up afterwards, if you have any questions that you just weren't able to ask now or thought of them afterwards, you are always welcome to email us, sales@snappii.com, and we will be glad to get that answer back to you. So going into advanced lists or advanced forms, the first thing you need to do is set up your data sources. Now I have some already in here, and I'll walk through these with you. Again, for those of you who are familiar excuse me, with advanced lists at all, typically when you upload a list, a spreadsheet for a list with an advanced list, all the information is populated in your spreadsheet, and you're pulling that information into the app for the users to see. For example, you might be having a list of several different properties, and those properties, all the information is filled out, the location, you might have a photo, perhaps even longitude, latitude information for mapping purposes. When you drop your spreadsheet into your data source with an advanced list, all of that information exists on the list. You then allow your users to see that information in a list format within the app. For an advanced form, you also are uploading a spreadsheet, and the only thing the spreadsheet has in it are the column headers. So I'm going to download this and open it up for you. And you'll notice here that the information I have are my column headers, and there is one set of information filled out. This is actually because the form that we have created, or excuse me, the advanced form that we have created has been tested once. And when tested, the information we set up to populate back into the spreadsheet so that at any time I could download this information and I would have all of the details that were put in the form by the user within my spreadsheet. That's one of the options for how information can be submitted by way of an advanced form. For the purposes of setting up the data source in the first place, the spreadsheet that you're uploading would be completely blank other than the headers that you want to use. This way, again, all of the information that potentially appears here, for example, would be done by way of the information the user fills out, and it would then hit this spreadsheet on the back end. You can see that I have two forms here. I have my risk assessment form and my drill form. And you can see they are located here, and by default, Snappii will try to determine what type of information this particular header represents. In some cases, you may need to change the information that Snappii believes it is. But for example, photo will always show up as image. If for any reason when you were testing your form you were finding that something wasn't working, or you were seeing that the information was showing up blank where you thought there should be information, one thing to do is go back to your data source and take a look at your different column names and their types. If you have a column that has an incorrect type, that will cause the advanced form to not work or not show up correctly. So that's a great quick way to go in and check if something's not working correctly. Do you have all of your column types set up in the way that they need to be? So once you have your spreadsheets set up here, and I will say that data sources refers to two different types of source. One could be a spreadsheet. The other could be a data connector. And I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail about data connectors today because that is a whole topic in and among itself. And we do have both a webinar and a product tutorial that you can find from our website. If you go to snappii.com under the webinars page, you will see a button for educational webinars. You also can access product tutorials under our resources page of our website. And those, again, there are two videos, a webinar and a product tutorial walking through how to create a data connector. But basically, a data connector is a web services connector that allows you to connect with, for example, Salesforce, or a database that you have on the back end. It could be a MySQL server or some other database where you either want to pull in information or send out information. For example, information being filled out in a form, advanced form, excuse me. So as I showed you in a regular form, one of your options was web post mode, where you could have form information going to a URL, for example, and be posted there. In the cases of a data connector, based on how you set your connector up, information in your advanced form could populate somewhere within the data connector, again based on the fields that you have determined and the parameters of how you want to pull in that information. So just to clarify that a data source could either be a data connector or it could be done by way of spreadsheets, as we have done here. Once you have your spreadsheets uploaded, you've given them a name, and you've saved them, the second thing you want to do is actually go and create your advanced form and potentially advanced list associated with these sheets. I am just going to check questions again. I will do my best to remember to check them along the way here. So we're going to go into our Forms button. And what you're going to see here is sort of three individual and unique sections. What we actually did here, just so we don't confuse you, we showed you two different ways that you could use advanced forms and advanced lists together within your app. We just happened to put them in one place. So what I'm going to tell you is that the risk assessment summary, this is an advanced form. When the user fills out this information, it's actually going to populate within the app in an advanced list, because we wanted this information to be accessible by users of the app. So in this case, we created an advanced list, an advanced form associated with an advanced list, and we actually put the advanced list all by itself in another tab. And I will walk you through how that happened. The two forms here with the drill rig inspection, we created the advanced form here, and then the advanced list that gets populated right below it. So you could choose to have the information from both your form and your list within one tab or screen, or have information for the form in one tab or screen to be filled out, and then the completed information to be displayed in a list within another tab or screen. And so let's go into the risk assessment summary here, and we'll take a look at how it was set up. So again, we did a tab here where we housed our forms. Then we used the advanced form button over here, dropped it down into this tab, and this is what we see once we drop that down. Again, for those of you who are familiar with advanced lists, you will see that the advanced form backend is very similar. So your view, your label, and your title, again, the title would show up, excuse me, once you clicked into the form, you would see the title up at your top bar. And again, for those of you following along on your device, if you click onto the risk assessment summary form, we chose not to give it a label because we titled it inside the form itself. You would need to select the data source. Again, because you have information coming from and going to a data source or within your app into an advanced list, you need to tell the advanced form where it's getting that information and or where it's populating that information. So in this case, risk assessment was one of our advanced forms, one of our data sources. And so we are tying our advanced form to that. And you see here, drill was my other data source. If you had 10 data sources available in your editor, you would see all of the data sources show up, and you would simply pick from the list. You have the opportunity to determine if this is going to be submitted by email. As you can see here, exactly the same as we did in our standard form. You can determine the number of email addresses it's going to by putting them right here in the email address box. You can give it a subject line. This is for your own reference, so that when that email comes in to whomever, they'll know exactly what it is by the subject you have given it. You can determine how many of these advanced forms would be filled out before an email would be sent, and also your options for how it gets displayed, whether it is in the body of the email, in a spreadsheet format, or PDF, as we discussed with our basic form. And then configuring your element, this is just about the appearance of the button itself. So the height, the width, if you're going to view it as text only. In this case, we actually, although you do see text here, we wanted it to show up in a very specific way, using a particular font, different colors, have it framed in with the blue outline. So what we did was open up a Word document, create this information with word art, and then used the snipping tool and saved it as an image. And we were then able to have this image right here under specify your icon uploaded from the computer. You also could use any of the pre-built icons that we have available in our library, or you could find an image on the web to utilize for your icon. Again, also, you could show your button as text only to simplify your display if you chose to do so. And then, of course, your time settings, as we discussed with your regular form. Excuse me, in an advanced form, you have the opportunity to select your time settings, and that will give a time stamp to that advanced form. So when the information is submitted, there will be a time associated with it for record keeping purposes. So once you have done this, we then double-clicked on our form. This is where I actually pulled in all of the information that I wanted to show on my advanced form. So again, sort of your titles or headings, if you will, of your boxes were created by pulling over a text element, dropping it in, and filling it out, as we reviewed with the regular form. The only difference really with the advanced form presently as far as creating the form is that with the regular form, when we opened up our form, we had a wizard available where we could pick the different fields and add them as we walked through earlier. Here, you're going to drop over each of your items by using the form fields down here. All of the fields are the same in the advanced form as in the regular form that you had available to pick from. Excuse me. You just have also other fields that you can drop in as well that don't show up on the form fields but show up on the regular fields. Excuse me. So you can see here, as with our regular form, we have our location button. Also, as we did with our first form, we have the photo button so that you could take a photo and have it submitted. And then you don't see in the advanced form here any kind of a submit button. But for those of you following along on your device, if you are looking at this form now, you'll notice down at the bottom that there is a submit button available. And if you get the opportunity to fill out this form, once you hit the submit button, you will then be able to see what happened to that information, because as I mentioned, this particular form we set up so the information is going to be able to be viewed within the app in an advanced list right here. So the different fields that we have added here, again, I'm going to click on one. So we dragged over a text number field right here, and let me click on it for you. So you can see on the back end the information here. This is a date field. You have the ability to pick the format. In this case, it was a date. That way, when the user clicks on this field, the date pops up automatically, and they can select it if it doesn't happen to be today's date that you want them to put in there, as opposed to them having to manually enter the date by using their keyboard. And so once all of these fields are filled out and the user hits submit, in this case, that information is then going to populate my advanced list. So right here, this was an advanced list tab. We dropped it down, and I'm going to open it up for you on the back end so that you can see what it looks like. As with your advanced form, you can give it a title and a tab name. You can specify an icon for your tab. Under security, this is where you can determine if users are going to be allowed to add or edit information. If you are following along on your device, you will see in this case we actually did allow the permissions for users to be able to add or edit information directly to these forms after they have been filled out and dropped into this list. You do have the availability to make these forms unable to be anything but viewable. So you want your users to be able to see the information that was submitted, but not do anything with it after that point. Again, this security here will help you determine that availability. And then your list view. This is what you want the information to show up as to your users. The data source, again, a key piece of making this work. Advanced lists and advanced forms require data sources. Because I wanted the information in my advanced form for risk assessment to show up in my advanced list for risk assessment, I needed to also pick the risk assessment data source. And I can choose how I'm going to title my fields that show up. And those fields right here, my list view or cell view template, and my detail view. So for those of you following along on your device, if you've clicked on risk assessment, you should see that there is one field of information on this list. Because we've only tested this once, only one list item shows up. Based on the number of forms that are filled out, this would continue to compile on the list, and so you would see if 15 forms were filled out, you would see 15 list items here. What you're looking at right here is the list view. If you actually click on that item, you then will see the detail view. And there, excuse me, is information in there, again, based on what I told the app I wanted it to display to the end user. So in my case, I have it set up, and I'll show you on the back end here. If I click on my list view or my cell view, you'll see many different fields in here. I'm going to click on a field, and what I did in this case was I brought over a text element and dropped it down. And the information right here, this is for spacing purposes only. You could put anything you wanted in here, and it's not actually going to show up to the user on the back end, because the information that goes in here that the user is going to see on the list when they open it up is based on the data source information. If you look at this text field, again, I pulled over a text field and I named it date. And my data source I picked was constant. That's because I want date to show up on my advanced list so that if that information is something that's getting filled out, I want the user to know what that information relates to. Obviously, a date is pretty obvious. You'll see the date itself, but other fields like the name of the assessor, the location, things like that might not be as obvious on your list without having them labeled for your end users. So in this case, you would want the field to be constant. It's always going to say date. Here, however, I want the actual date information to show up. And so in my data source, in my source, I'm going to pick data source instead of constant. Data source tells this field, pull the information that was entered in the form, advanced form by the user in the date field into this section. Now you'll notice, again, if you're following along, that the date field on the advanced list itself on the device is blank. That's because when I was testing, I didn't make the date field a required field to have to be filled out, and I did not fill it out when I tested the form. So under date field, no information shows up, and that is why. You can choose whether or not all of the information in your form is required or not. And so each one of these fields followed exactly that same process. I dropped a text box over. I made it constant so that the label or title of the field always shows up, and then dropped over a text field, mapped it to my data source, and picked which field I wanted it to pull information from. Then in my detail view, I did exactly the same thing, but the information that I wanted to show up here was far more limited. The only information I wanted to show up here was the item number. And you can see here, I chose my data source and item as my field. And I wanted the image to show up that the user took while filling out the form. And just like with the text, I brought over an image button. I opened it up, configured the height and width. I told it I wanted to pick from the data source and from the photo field. This way, when that form is filled out, the user has submitted a photo along with that form. That specific photo is going to show up in the detail view. That's all I chose to put in my detail view, but I could put any number of items, text fields, and photo fields just as I did in my cell view if I so chose. So for those of you following along on your device, when you click on the list view in the risk assessment form or tab, you'll see that there is textual information in there. And if you click on that list item, you'll see the number 1, which is represented by the item field. And then you'll see the photo. This is the photo that I took and submitted with the form, and that shows up based on the way you have set it up here on the back end. So again, I am just going to check the question box quickly. And I don't see any questions here, which is not a bad thing. Hopefully I'm not going too fast for anyone. Going back to our form tab here, secondarily, right here under my drilling rig inspection and my inspection form storage, I followed exactly the same process as we just went through with the risk assessment summary. I set up my advanced form. Again, labeling it, titling it, and choosing my image. My image in this case was some word art that I had saved as a photo. I selected my data source. This time, I selected the drill data source because the information I'm pulling and populating is different. I did not choose to submit by email because, as with the risk assessment summary, I want this information to show up in the app within an advanced list. And I chose the way that my image is going to show up as far as height and width and my timestamp. And the only thing I did differently with this form than with my risk assessment form is that instead of the advanced form sitting here and when filled out populating an advanced list in another tab, I set up my advanced form here and also my advanced list that gets populated by that form right here underneath it in the same tab. So if you are following along in your device, you'll see the drill rig initial inspection advanced form button. You can click on it and see that there's information in there. And you have the opportunity to change that information for testing purposes, or obviously if the form is actually being filled out when in live use. You can also go back in and click on the inspection form storage button, which is our advanced list. That houses the information that was completed in my inspection form here. And I'm going to open up the advanced list for you. And everything is the same that we just went through for the advanced list, how it's displayed, the security. Again, we did allow permission for app users to edit the information that's on this list. You certainly can allow no permission, so it is just a readable list only. And then my list view, again, this is really the heart of where I can determine what my users see and in what format. I chose custom for both my list view and my detail view because it gives me the largest amount of flexibility in what my users see. My email settings did not utilize, again, because I want this information to be populated directly within the app itself. And then if we click on the advanced list, again, you're going to see the cell view and the detail view. In this case, my text here, I did exactly as I had done before. I pulled over a text button. I labeled the information with what I wanted. So I'm going to pull it down here. It's a little crowded. And I said that it was constant because I wanted my users to see a label for each of the items that was listed there. And then my other text button, I labeled with my data source, telling it that I wanted it to pull phone information from the form that was the advanced form that was completed. And here you can also see that I have some different photos. These two photos I made as constant. So no matter how many items are on the advanced list after the advanced forms are filled out, if there are 20 forms filled out and submitted, 20 different items will show up on the list. Every time they show up, these two pictures here are going to remain the same because I chose to make them constant. This is actually the image of the signature. I'm going to move this out of the way for a minute so that you can see. Here, I pulled over my photo button, dropped it down, but instead of asking it to show the photo that was taken and submitted by the user when filling out the advanced form, I wanted it to show me the signature so that I could see that this information had been completed and I had a documented signature associated with it. So I selected from my data source and chose my signature field. And my detail view then, now you can see there's a huge amount of information in this detail view as opposed to the first detail view you saw in our risk assessment list. It's because I wanted all of the information that had been filled out about my form to populate here. So if you'll notice, again, dropped over my text boxes and labeled each one of them so that my users can see exactly what information the right column associates with in the left column. And I follow that same process all the way down my form. So here, this is constant information. This is the label. So I put what I wanted it to be called and made sure that it was constant. And then over here, this is where it is pulling the information from my form and being filled in as it is completed out by the user. If you're following along on your smart device, you'll see that the first level of information, which has the subcontractor's name, their phone number, a few constant images, and a signature, that's my list view or my top view of my advanced list. If I click on that, you will then see all of the information that was filled in within the drill inspection form. That all shows up here, and up at the top where there is a work location and date, you'll see the latitude and longitude displayed there as opposed to the map, but the user followed the same process as before. When they were filling out the form, they clicked the location box, they selected the location from the map, and that information for latitude and longitude was automatically pulled into the form and displayed here as latitude and longitude based on how I selected that field to show up. I am just going to look at the question box again here. Okay. And it doesn't look like we have any questions. So in total, this is what I'm going to show you today related to advanced forms and what I would call, I guess, a basic or standard form, both of which allow you to have very detailed forms filled out and submitted in a number of different ways. Just to sort of quickly review, when you are using a regular form, you have the opportunity to have that information submitted by email to one or several email addresses, or you could have it submitted by way of a web post. Excuse me. Again, submitting through web post, you have a couple of options. That information could be being filled out and actually submitted to a web URL that you specify where all the information is collected. or the form could actually be set up as a get form, for example, with weather, where your user filled out their zip code and information was returned into the app with weather information related to their zip code. When you want to be able to have more flexibility in the information presentation, for example, if you want your information to be able to be populated back into the data source so that you could download that information later, or perhaps be connected by way of a data connector to a database on your back end, perhaps Salesforce or a MySQL server, you could use an advanced form. To use an advanced form, you first want to create your data sources, as we did here. Again, these data sources are either spreadsheets, which would be blank other than the header information, like we have here, column names, also referred to as headers, or your data source could be a data connector, either using a pre-built connector that we have available for you, or building one of your own. Again, we have detailed videos, both a webinar and a product tutorial about data connectors available from the Snappii website. And as well, our user manual, which you can find under the resources tab of the snappii.com website, has detailed information on how to create a data connector as well. So once you have created your data sources, you then can create your advanced forms by way of an advanced form tab or by way of an advanced form button. Again, if you wanted to be able to have perhaps multiple forms on one tab, if you wanted to have multiple forms on one tab, you could use your advanced form button to bring in those different forms. Your advanced forms you can have submitted by email, just like your regular form. You can also have it populate to the data source itself. So I'm going to go back into the data source here. As we had looked at before with risk assessment, I had done a single test of filling out a form and had it populate right to my data source. So right here, all my information exists. This is even the photo that I took. If you're having your information submitted back to your data source so that you can then download that data later on, you will see that the photo shows up as a URL. You actually could go to that URL and see the photo that was submitted. So if 15 forms had been submitted, set up this way, you would see 15 line items of data with everything completed. Pulling that information from my data source, if that's how I had set it up with my advanced form, at any time I could go into the WYSIWYG editor, download the data, and I would get the latest information in my data source. I also have the ability to have the information emailed, just like with the regular form. Or if my data source were a data connector and I had set up the parameters to tell the data source that when the form was filled out, it would submit that information to my data connector and thereby appear on my backend database, again based on how I configured my data connector. I could do that with my advanced form as well. The other piece of advanced forms, which we didn't address today, only because again it's quite time consuming to get through everything, is setting up data sources with relationships so that you can then use your advanced forms and advanced lists with even further complex associations. We will do another webinar that specifically talks about relationships with your advanced forms. However, if you want to get some information ahead of time on how relationships work, we do have information in the way of a video from a previous webinar that I did regarding advanced lists and relationships. Just like with advanced forms, which are similar to advanced lists in many of the fields, relationships for advanced forms are also very similar to relationships in advanced lists. So if you wanted to get an understanding of how relationships work You could certainly view the webinar about complex data apps that is available as well on the Snappii website under the webinars section, and that will help you get a pretty solid understanding of how relationships work. We also have very detailed information in our user manual, again found under the resources section of the Snappii.com website, which will walk you through how relationships are set up with data sources. Those relationships are really going to be set up virtually the same when you're using advanced forms as when you're using advanced lists. But we will have another webinar as well that walks you through how to create relationships specifically related to advanced forms. So I am just going to check the question box one more time here. And I don't see any questions. So at this point, I will tell you that there will be a follow-up email that will go out. There will be a link to the video for this webinar so that you could view it again in the future as a resource. Of course, feel free to email us with any questions at sales@snappii.com. I thank you so much for joining our webinar today, and have a nice day.